and Sergio will collaborate and come up with some animations that will refer to our groups. So we'll, stay tuned. And it's also going to be on the channel. So it's going to be historical animations, summaries or something. Some kind of like, what did you call it, Sergio? Reenactment, right? Reenactment of.
No, I was just thinking about more like maps that have a little bit of geography and stuff like that. Just to get a bit of visual that has.
But eventually,
I'm
we'll
not sure what it's called, but yeah.
Yeah, but eventually we'll do a reenactment as well, right? Like.
Yeah, sure.
How the Romans.
I mean, depending on the subject, sure. Yeah.
Like, for example, I'm mostly interested in how the Romans lived, how the Greeks lived, what they ate, and then maybe at some point, we'll just kind of like do it in somebody's house. We'll dress in tunic and stuff like that. It would be like a theater. Why not?
For sure. I'm always down.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Look, Greg wanted to say something.
No, they call it toga party, right?
Toga party, yeah. Let's do toga party, yeah. And it's something that posts on the channel that people like it, subscribe, whatever. And eventually, when COVID is going away, I want to create groups where we can travel together somewhere, like Greece, Rome, whatever, and we could taste different foods, talk about history. I have not seen a channel that knows so much history as we do. This is like, between all of us, it's crazy amount of history that we have.
Yeah. Uzbekistan, you gotta go there eventually.
Yeah. Well, that's the last place I want to go to right now. I mean, they really snatch people from the streets right now.
Really?
Yeah, Corona is. I'm telling you, if you don't wear a mask, they charge you. Yeah, and it's really nasty.
Well, we're not going to travel for a while until this
I'm not talking about
virus goes away. Yeah.
Let me welcome some. Miriam is here. Bonjour. Daniel is here.
Bonjour.
How are you? Anna is here. Mikhail is here. Who else? Beverly is here. Nice. Debbie, how are you? Welcome back. Ralph is here. John, Joe is here. John, sorry I sent you the thing late yesterday. I totally keep. Apologies for that. And Zoran is here. Hi, Zoran. So you want to give it a couple more minutes, and while you're at it, Aaron, can you give a little summary what you talked about last time? We kind of have now a part 2 of our Pacific War.
And what I want to kind of do is, as I've gone through this, is realize there's like not 10, but there's definitely more than just 1 or 2 parts to this, because, or at least the way I think it adds a lot of interesting value, if that makes any sense. So, because I think it gets really, I won't say easy, but there is a sort of accepted, simple understanding of the war in the Pacific, which hopefully that's what we can sort of tease apart and pull apart, and recognize it almost as really a set of wars that ultimately become, the Asiatic Pacific, super conflict, from the 20s till really until VJ Day, basically in 45, which really doesn't end then either, because you have communists fighting in China against the nationalists. So that doesn't really end in 49, and then it keeps going. Korean War, et cetera. So it's. So what I tried to do is spend a lot of energy last couple of weeks ago with tremendous help from Hadrian and Richard to really go over the social, cultural, political, and economic drivers and dynamics that were going on in Japan and in the world after World War I that is really set the table for these conflicts, which I believe most people have a good understanding of why those same conflicts occurred in Europe, but most people don't sort of have a weighted version of the same answers when it comes to the conflicts across the, Asia Pacific, basically. So the goal was to really lay out, why the Bushido Code in Japan and the militarists and this sort of new culture of becoming a, let's just call it at a minimum, a regional, if not a global superpower, became fundamental in Japanese culture, which wasn't there, 5 years earlier. And then the political instability that was going on underneath it all, which in this larger sort of context was really, it's a strange dynamic. I mean, you see this happening in, I think, all over the world, right? I mean, you could say we had our version of this. You almost have two phases of becoming modern. You have the industrialization phase where, rails put in and massive industrialization are put in, but then the culture goes through a shift, especially if you had a feudal type society, which Japan definitely had, even if it was sort of a neo-feudal sort of modern version. And that's what got really shook out into the 20s and into the 30s, which is really kind of where we left this, and where we pick it up today. So that's sort of a high level of it. And we went into, what was the environment globally after World War One and Treaty of Versailles and in essence, the naval treaty in 21-22 in Washington, between almost all the powers in the world, except for basically Russia and Germany. And in essence, the losers of World War One. Russia was sort of not really a loser, but because they transitioned to communism, they were sort of, in this no man's land. So that was. I mean, that's really high level, but I don't know. Is that good enough?
Well, I think I liked where you started last time. So 1921 Washington Treaty. I think that's where that was the seed of the whole conflict, and people don't know a lot about it. So talk about that a little bit. I guess start the presentation. So that probably be, because it's also identified how many carriers can each country build, and I think you can get into that a little bit because it kind of sets a prelude to the whole thing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So let me go. Let me jump to my slide on this before I do that, because I want to find the right slide to talk about that a little bit. Sorry about that. Give me a second here to.
Are you presenting slides? Because we didn't see anything.
Oh, I will. No, I wanted
okay.
I wanted to get the right slide to sort of talk about the Treaty of 21, so that it. Here we go. Perfect. Hold on. Just give me a second. Yeah. Let me just start showing slides real quick here. And you guys tell me when you see this.
Yeah, we can see it. Yeah.
There we go. Let me just go to the show current slide. Tell me when. Okay, so and I'd like to obviously make this as interactive as possible. I think we had a really good conversation a few weeks ago. Hopefully everyone enjoyed that, and feel free to just sort of dive in. So one of the things that we talked about, sorry, let me clean up all this stuff here. I never like all these floating things they have. So the Washington Disarmament Conference, which was created after, well, it was in essence created as part of the Treaty of Versailles after World War One, was this arguably the world's first modern treaty and process to create a treaty. And so what that did is, all right, let me just go here, sorry. There was a bunch of pieces to it that, we sort of forget about the fact that Japan was on the Allies side in World War One, because obviously they cared more about protecting their own interests. They weren't on our side for the support of the Western nations against the Axis, against Germany and their allies. But ultimately they were a party to the winning side of World War One, and they had a long-standing relationship, at that point, really almost 20 years, with the British and, in essence, the British Empire, and it was really about how to divvy up the Pacific, or at least divvy up the Pacific that wasn't either Dutch or French or German or American. And most people forget that Germany had possessions in the Pacific, not a lot, but a few significant ones. And as a loser of World War One, well, Japan wanted their divvy, in essence, just like the British did and others. So the Washington Disarmament Conference was this, conference that in essence wanted to descale down naval warfare dramatically, which was it's a brilliant idea. I mean, arguably it's no different than nuclear disarmament theory. I mean, it's really nuclear disarmament theory is basically built on the Washington, and they talk about it if you go look at 500, 600, 700 level grad courses, at George Washington or Georgetown or Johns Hopkins.
Oh my God.
Oh, are you guys there? Hello? I heard someone say, "Oh my God." So. Did I get it?
Go ahead. Yeah, you keep going. It's just, it was just.
Someone had an event. The goal was to, in essence, manage down the scale of the battleships, which battleships were viewed as, the preeminent fighting tool or platform in the world at that point. Air power was still very novel and very new.
I'm the one who sent it to you. I put on the top of this from Greg.
Guys, can you go on mute? I'm not on mute. You know that. Okay.
Aaron, you can mute everybody, at this point.
I just don't like muting everyone.
Sorry, Aaron, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Hello?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so this five-power treaty, this is nothing to do, was the League of Nations even taking shape at this point? Was this something just within those 5 countries?
No. There were 9 countries as part of it. Sorry, let me go back to this. So there were 9 countries as part of it. It was tied into the League of Nations, which was and I'll get into the League of Nations a little later as part of the presentation. So all of these pieces were tied together. They were, in essence, the Treaty of Versailles, or they were tied into building a world of no war. That was the underlying philosophy, in essence, which was very Wilsonian. So President Wilson was one of the 3-4 big architects of this newer world that they wanted to conceive, which was, the largest countries on Earth were going to, which of course the world at that point had an enormous amount of colonies. So, it was a world that had basically about 1/5 of the nations that we have today. So it was, it was definitely a world. So basically about 10 of those 40 countries in the world were part of this. And when you look at the Treaty of Versailles, it's, basically it's almost all the countries, 25 countries of the 44 that existed at that point, 46, I think. So remember, it was a smaller world given the colonial scale of the world too. So, so the numbers seem small, but it's relative to the world that we were in.
Okay.
Does that make sense? No.
Yeah, sure. For sure.
Um,
Thank you.
Sure. And so the goal was that if you could keep battleships down, which, you know, if any of you remember the Cold War, you know, especially when in the, let's say starting in the, you know, let's say basically starting in the 70s into the 80s, when we were trying to negotiate start 1, 2, et cetera, it was always about these massive nuclear weapons. It was either lots of small, very portable ones that could hide. Think of those as, you know, lots of little pocket destroyers and submarines, which the five-power treaty covered, or these massive, you know, nuclear weapons, you know, 5, 10, 20 megaton, which is in essence what the battleships really were. And so the goal was that if you could contain everybody into a small number of these, it would make unrestricted invasion level warfare harder. Even if it occurred, it would be limited because the sea power would be limited to expand it. So that was, you know, and there was some small, there was no restrictions on the smallest warship. So that was like a loophole. So like the tiny, so that was there was a concept called the pocket destroyer, which was sort of invented then, which is sort of like a fake destroyer that is really almost the same firepower of a destroyer, just a lot lighter and less armored. So anyways, that's is that enough on the 21, or do you want me to?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to it. I guess Roosevelt at the time wanted to pass the law to bring it up to that level and build extra carrier because of the fact that, you know, they had a restriction, and he wanted to bring it up to that level and even a little bit more. So America was ready, you know, in that regard, and therefore Japan was only restricted to 1/3 what America and France and everybody else could build, and only could obviously, you know, protect their own territories, but could not invade anywhere else. Sorry, just wanted to add.
Sorry, let me get back to my main slides here. Sorry. Let me stop this for a second until I get back to these slides. What's going on here? Sorry, my slides are hanging right now. I should have carved the deck up a little bit more.
How many slides do you have?
Well, so what it is, it's not so much how many slides do I have in this presentation. It's sort of the whole Pacific War.
Oh, I see.
So
I see.
yeah, so it's pretty big when you count the whole Pacific War. But
Right,
obviously, I'm not presenting those today because then that would we would have a 24-hour presentation, which
that's all right. Susan doesn't mind. She likes you know, World War II. So
there we go. All right, hold on. Let me get back here. Okay, let me get to the slideshow and play from start. So I named this sort of, you know, which was one of the names that the Japanese had used, which is called Ketsugo, a decisive operation. They had 4 or 5 of these type of slogans, which sort of defined their operating culture from a fighting standpoint, in the Navy especially, which we'll get into whether it's this presentation or some future one, maybe, you know, a few months from now or whatever, when we keep going in the Pacific until you guys are really sick of it, which really ultimately contributed to their losses, because there was an operating culture they had, which we didn't really talk about a couple of weeks ago, especially within the Navy, that it was almost like a corporate sales performance bonus culture, if that makes any sense to any of you that work in the corporate world like I do. You know, no one wants to come back and say, ooh, I have these 3 little accounts or these 3 little deals. They didn't really reward people for that. They wanted to say, hey, I went and sunk a battleship, or let's go and in essence take all this risk, which of course is strange when you think of how conservative Japanese culture can be. So, you know, we talked a little bit about this a couple of weeks ago, just really in how radically this period shifted sort of Japanese society. So we covered the summary, and then Japan shifts into war state is really the kind of core to this whole thing. And I wanted to cover really everything that they did in the 30s or happened in the 30s as much as we can, because it's I mean, number one, the war with the U.S. is astronomical. That's sort of, I mean, this is just this Central Pacific Theater and North Pacific Theater, the fights that existed from the end of, from Pearl Harbor. When you count, East Pacific, when you count the rest of them, it's basically twice this size. So, there's no way that can fit in, in an hour or two. I mean, without just saying. Now, one thing I am going to do, I found a fantastic number of YouTube videos that have been produced by some really great people on almost all of these. And they're not too long. Some are as short as 5 or 10 minutes, and some are longer, 20, 30 minutes or whatever. And for the ones that either you've never heard of or you've just heard the name, those could be something interesting to sort of look at. And if we kind of in the future have time to really dig in, then I can sort of bring these out. So one of the things I wanted to talk about was really, this sort of gets back to another version a few weeks ago, which is the environment that existed in the Pacific, which once again just didn't start war randomly in 1931 or 1937 or 1940, 41. It was really a continuation, and Japan, in essence, was on a collision course, whether it was with the colonial Europeans or ultimately with the United States, and that's really what this larger story is. And a big part of it was China, what we think of China today is, and then also what China was then.
Can I ask a quick question, Aaron?
Sure. Yeah, any question, please.
What was the population of Japan at this time?
Yeah, so the population in 1910 was about 50 million. And at the start, population exploded between 1910 and 1940, or basically until really the United States entered the war, right? I mean, that changed the population.
And does anybody know what was the population of Germany?
Ooh, I don't. That's a good question. I'm sure someone can maybe.
I'm just
70 million.
I think they're approximately comparable.
Yeah.
70 million at the end of World War I.
Okay, there you go.
Very comparable.
Yeah, so Japan was 70 million basically in 1940. So, and so yeah, they're very, very, very comparable. So, so a couple things, and I want to throw this Korea piece in because I didn't throw it in a couple of weeks ago. I realized I should have. Richard sort of brought it up, it's kind of like as a quick drive-by, but I felt it was sort of important because it contributed to this kind of entanglement that ultimately happened between the U.S., Japan, colonial European powers, and what became the various forms of puppet or civil war China in the 30s. In essence, Japan occupied Korea and really, sort of completely took it over. And they banned language. I mean, and I think we had a presentation a while back where we took, where Richard went over Korea, and the relationship with China, 1,000 years ago, 700 years ago, et cetera. So really the Japanese just did a modern version of what the Chinese, tried to do and ultimately did for, a few hundred years, on and off. So, it was really a complete takeover of the country, down to sort of daily living, how kids learned in school, what they learned in school, the fact people couldn't own businesses. I mean, it was, and in essence annexed it. and it'll come back. So if you remember this, when there's a time a little later in the presentation where this comes back, because in essence, when Japan starts really breaking the treaties that it didn't really want to sign, which we talked about a little bit a couple of weeks ago, part of them getting on normalized terms is ultimately, leaving China, leaving Korea, et cetera. And of course, for the Japanese, that just, they're not going to give up anything for practical reasons, but also for face-saving reasons. So, by the way, is Louisa here or no? I don't know, because I was hoping she could pop in, but because I know she has a tremendous background.
I connected with her. I offered.
Okay.
I
All right. No,
hear that.
I didn't. I mean, I'm not looking at my. I should probably. I don't want to log in on my phone because then it'll. I just don't want to create other feedbacks. But so I just couldn't see everyone there. So I wanted to cover sort of the prelude of the environment, which was what was going on in China, which was the end of the imperial China, which the 1912 was the last dynastic emperor. Kind of a sort of factual, sort of not factual movie. Whatever that is now, 30 years ago, I guess. And what would really happen is, like almost everywhere in the world, when you get rid of central controlling power, you create a vacuum, and it's almost always taken up by warlords. The concept of warlordism. So you had a very similar process there. You had a Chinese Nationalist Party, which in essence overthrew the emperor and becomes the first president, but he couldn't unite the country. And then, of course, presidency turns over to a general who sort of becomes a little famous. We'll get into him. And so it basically becomes sort of a dictatorship that's overrun by warlords. So it has a very Afghanistan sort of feel a little bit, not just there. I mean, that's been the case in dozens of places. One thing people forget, and I did, and is that China declared war on Germany in as part of World War I. And so, that was part of their strategy, not a bad idea, of being on the right side at the right time.
Aaron, that's the Kuomintang who did that?
Sorry? Yes. And so, and this gets to this earlier point around Japan also being on the same side as China, even though the Chinese and the Japanese weren't on the same side of each other. So that was the strange bedfellows in World War I. And of course, this created a feedback loop because as part of Treaty of Versailles, Japan, being on the right side, negotiated that they wanted the former German territory in what became China, which of course that started this cycle all over again between the Japanese and the Chinese, which really never stopped. Here's sort of a time lapse almost. I didn't list them all out, but these are a bunch of warlords from 1920 to 1926 across China. So you had this sort of warlordism. This map literally looks like Afghanistan. It's and you had these sort of very, big, meaningful conflicts with low amounts of violence, if that makes sense. I mean, not to say any violence is good, but I mean, this wasn't millions of people in conflict with each other in terms of dying on the battlefield, right? These were small, small skirmishes, very unprofessionalized combatants, sort of what you'd expect from warlord type fighting. And, here was one sort of famous, this guy's out of central casting of what a warlord should look like, Young Shikai. And, he was a pretty successful one. There was, dozen, I don't know, 40 of them, I think is the number 36, something like that. And it's a really interesting thing. I'm actually going to eventually dig in on it because it's really funky that over a small period of you had such warlordism. And then you had the nationalists, who arguably were sort of one of the super warlords almost. They wanted a sort of a united China under a system of government, in essence, some form of a nationalist dictatorship. And then you had this young guy, really smart, sort of college student, Mao Zedong. This is one of his earlier photos with his big flowing hair. The guy had great hair. I mean, in his whole lifetime. And so he was a student of Marxism, and I wanted to sort of involve them because they are important as Japan invades Manchuria and China. The relationship that goes on, this sort of three-dimensional chess between the nationalists, the communists, the Japanese, the colonial powers, the U.S., it's like, 8 actors sort of all playing chess with each other until it all falls apart, of course. This is a little older picture of him, but he was pretty simple. He wanted a communist revolution, and he wanted to, build a peasant-based or peasant-first society, and Leninist playbook 101 stuff. Okay. So he led the May 4th movement in 1919. So this was sort of interesting because within the communists, there was there was 3 groups, really. There was sort of a purist form of communist, by the book. There was sort of a global version of it, which, clearly was feeding back off of what was going on in the Soviet Union and across Central and Eastern Europe, which people forget, and even parts of the Middle East, that had early communist movements that were fed off of the Soviet successes of the Bolshevik revolution. So. And then there was the nationalist version, which is really what he was, and that group really grew. They sort of tapped, what was really there was a lot of hunger for that, right? There's a hunger for having a Chinese sort of first movement, and that started the CCP basically, which is 100 years old now, or 101 years old, and the KMT, fought back. They had these sort of, retribution events. They would find and arrest and kill kind of individuals, but that sort of escalated over time by the mid-20s, and where there's called the Shanghai Massacre, which is over 5,000, somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 Communist Party members were killed. And one thing about Sun, who I should have had this slide a little earlier, but he's the one that sort of the godfather of the nationalist movement, the 3 principles of the people, and sort of a China first, given China's relationship to the colonial world, for quite a while. And the fact that they were always, sort of chopped up by, everybody, and it was almost like the great game that existed in Central Asia. China was sort of the Pacific version of that. And then Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, he led the nationalists after Sun died, and Jiang Jiechi became the head of the Kuomintang. And they were fervent anti-communists. They were supported by the commercial classes, by the vested existing interests, sort of in the let's say the middle class or and above, I'd say solidly. And so that was not quite open civil war, but it was clearly moving in that direction, especially after the Shanghai massacre.
It was interesting, Aaron, just wanted to note it. When I was a kid, they said there was 4 generalissimus ever produced. And the 3 of them were Stalin, Suvorov, or Chaikanshi.
Yeah.
which is weird. Stalin is not a generalissimo.
No, that's true. So a couple interesting things. One thing people don't realize is that actually Mao Zedong was actually, in essence, studying to be a librarian, like a library science, early versions, which was actually pretty technical even then, because there was quite a few standards that were implemented. And so he was almost in the perfect position academically, because this wasn't the internet and radio and TV. I mean, so people went to libraries. That's how you were able to study, check books out. Not everyone had a copy of a book for a particular course, so you would have it for 5 days or 3 days or whatever. Students would come in. Go ahead. Sorry.
One minor thing. Yeah, that's actually, I think that's fairly well known, at least among Chinese people, that he was a librarian. And
Sure.
The interesting thing is that many other, Marxist-Leninist leaders were also extreme bookworms, including Marx, obviously. And Enver Hoxha of Albania, his library was huge.
Yep.
And Lenin called himself a man of letters when he had to leave Switzerland. So just an interesting thing. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, one advantage he had, especially as a young student organizer, is that every time someone would check a book out, he'd put a little red card in, or whatever the week's sort of schedule of, events, kind of, meetings, coffee shop type activities. And so it became this transmission mechanism. And then, he would eventually, pass them out to other librarians. And, so it's one of the ways he built this extremely strong academic and sort of intellectual cadre to the founding of the CCP. Most of those people he got rid of 40 years later. That's a whole nother show. But these were the people early on.
Hey, Aaron?
Yes.
I'm curious if you're going to speak to the symbology of that cartoon.
Oh, yes. So that's great. I mean, so, I
got a young China, and then you've got, I guess, the Japanese Empire, but then you have, interestingly, a fascisti right there in the lower left.
Yep.
What's that doing there?
I mean, there's a whole world of these, and I know there's some people who literally, this is their thing. They study these sort of, caricatured, and, many of which are racist and or don't fit for today's world. But the way we communicate, because, we didn't have TV, and it was very, very early radio. I mean, so really we didn't have radio. So, this was the Instagram, or Twitter of the day, is you'd have these cartoons, which all the symbology, which was very powerful. I've included some of those, some of the ones that I think are, let's say, less offensive, or sort of fit at least what the mindset was at that time. And there was a very strong understanding that, at least from a practical standpoint, that China was sort of this chaotically carved up state that was trying to create its own-ness, right? Its own, identity, both at a geographical level, at a cultural level, et cetera. And, there was a very strong, in some cases, majority in many countries. The United States was definitely one of them. Great Britain wasn't, but within many intellectual classes, there's a big minority in many other countries that wanted to see China, be able to be on its own 2 feet and sort of, not say be left alone, but at least become a member of the world of nations. So hopefully that sort of hits that a little bit. General Chiang Kai-shek becomes president, nationalist China in 28, basically drops the hammer. At that point, you basically have a civil war. In the Chinese Civil War becomes, incredibly intense. You have, armed gangs running around. I mean, in essence, proxies all over the country. In the 20s, you start to have almost a balance of power in the world that starts to either recognize the Chinese leadership or not. Obviously, the Soviets don't, because Mao's at least a friend then, for at least another couple decades until he's not. And so the Chinese Civil War, and I'll get into kind of the Long March, which is in the mid 30s, and sort of what happens, and that's sort of this real mythology and realness that happens as part of the Chinese Civil War. I mean, this is where he proves his guerrilla sort of campaign management.
Question, Aaron, are those numbers for real?
Yes, absolutely.
So out of 100,000,
Mm-hmm.
there were 8,000 survivors, and they managed to prevail.
I mean, they managed to prevail in the good old-fashioned guerrilla war approach, which is stay alive, stay around, and stay, and stay in the fight, right? Which is what they did. And then, of course, they could reconstitute, obviously, a new, 50, 100,000. And one of the mistakes.
Well, reconstituting isn't easy.
No, it's not easy, but one advantage.
Driven into the mountains, by an overwhelming force, how do you come back from that?
I mean, how did Washington come back? It's the narrative, right? The narrative matters.
The numbers weren't the same.
No, but the point is the narrative matters, right? The narrative isn't irrelevant, right? When you get chased, you stay alive. People know you're alive.
Okay.
People want to join your fight. I mean, that's sort of the history of successful guerrilla leaders. And you could say Mao was a successful political leader, and he was a successful guerrilla leader because of this. And it wasn't just this. The Long March is just one. It's the big one, but there was many others that were smaller, where they took pretty substantial losses, maybe not 90% in the others, but they took big losses in people. But the fact that you stay around, is a narrative. And the challenge you had that is really sort of a mistake. I mean, it was almost like he had no choice, but China was not stable yet, and the nationalists didn't truly have control over all the provinces, and more importantly, the forces were sort of nationalists when they got paid, and local when they didn't, and that made it really hard to keep sustaining this long fight. And that tends to be what guerrillas do, is drag out. The history of guerrilla warfare is, if you can get past that first 5 years, it usually gets you to 10 or 20 or 30 years, so at least 10 or 20. You see that in Colombia, you see it in many places. So this is where the Long March took place. It established the intellectual core beliefs, and like I said a minute ago, the narrative, which allowed them to sort of retransmit or radiate back out, which is what they did. So it put huge. So the challenge the nationalists had is they chased them around the whole country, and then when they couldn't get them, the communists started rebuilding, not just as a fighting force, but as a political force, but far away from where they were founded. So now the nationalists had to throw more resources at it, And of course, they weren't throwing resources just at the guerrillas, they were throwing resources at the local population, which of course creates this feedback loop of the local population being against you, right? And then they would lose local forces to, would switch sides to the Red Army. And it just, it was a sort of a vicious feedback loop that the nationalists sort of were stuck in.
John, here, were the Soviets supporting the CCP in any way?
Yeah, no. By the 30s, they were. It was pretty substantial by then, too. I mean, substantial in relative terms. I mean, it was advisors, it was material, especially once they got close to Inner Mongolia, because the Mongolians were on the Soviet side. So, once they got there, that was one of the reasons they wanted to get there, is they wanted to get support. So they were able to get support, and once that happened, really, at that point, it was almost going to be impossible for the nationalists to have a unified country. At best, could have imagined a partition, but that would have required, a Chinese support in these provinces that were still, these were still warlord provinces. They just happened to be aligned to the nationalists. So, and then these are some of the famous pictures of,
relationship with regards to particularly Marxism, but in general.
Hello.
That's one thing. I'm 58. I've been married for 4 years. I'm blessed with my wife. But I was expected to be married at the time.
Wait, Jorge, you're not on mute. You there? Okay. So, all right. So let's see. So also what happened too is that, and I'm going to pivot into the Manchurian. And this is kind of a hard thing to do, because either I go by chronology, but then you're sort of lost in all the different events and cycles, or I kind of pick one, go through a period of time, and then come back and sort of pick another one. I kind of picked that approach. You tell me if that makes sense to you guys. If in the end you wanted just a hard chronology, I'll do that in the future. So Japan by this point had already obviously invaded Manchuria in 31, which we'll cover next. And there was this strange game theory chess going on between all these parties. So when the Japanese were fighting, let's say, the nationalists, the local nationalists, like the warlord nationalists, the communists might not support them. The nationalists maybe would support them only as much as they could because they were still fighting the communists. If the Japanese were overwhelming a region, then there became this sort of standoff between the communists and the nationalists, which are, well, are we going to go in and help them or not? And so there's this really interesting world of go-betweens that was sort of built like emissaries that were sort of, they were hands off. You couldn't hurt them because they were the critical part of communication, right? You didn't have phone lines, right? You didn't have a lot of the modern, technologies. And the goal was to sort of create a national united, or in essence, a united front against the Japanese, sort of a war of national resistance. And Chiang Kai-shek viewed the communists as his first threat and the Japanese as a second threat. Not everyone in his command believed that, but there was debate, and there was also the same sort of debate with the communists too. So you really had this very complicated relationship. It's almost the way Yugoslavia was during, World War II, on all these weird sides, fighting in all these weird directions. So 37, the Chinese sort of really come together in what's called the total resistance by the whole nation. Rolls off the tongue easily, but that was basically the slogan.
Before you go on, what the slide said something about Chiang Kai-shek being kidnapped?
Oh yeah. So so what happened is, there was really this sort of fight philosophically between all these leaders. What are we going to do about the Japanese? And it's basically, what's the order we're going to deal with all this? They all knew they had to figure out their fight between each other, but also the Japanese. And the communists at a certain point realized, they realized this was going to be a national war against the Japanese before Chiang Kai-shek did, the KMT did. And they couldn't get through to him, so they basically kidnapped him. They put him up in a really nice chalet.
Was he kidnapped by other members of the Kuomintang? That's the way I understand this.
Yeah. So what happened is there became sort of a fusion group between the two, which was this national resistance group. It was made up of parties from both sides, and they couldn't get their leaders. Mao was signed on to a national resistance, but he was only going to go as far in as he saw the nationalists went in, because he didn't want to take the risk of getting flanked, and being double crossed, which was probably a big risk that was going to happen anyways. So this group, this younger kind of group said, you know what, we'll deal with that later. Right now, we won't have that problem to deal with if we don't deal with the Japanese. And so they basically, kidnapped him and forced him to agree to this national war against the Japanese. And then once he agreed to that, Mao agreed to it, and then they began the process. But it didn't go very well because they didn't have unified command. It was just all the pieces you need to do these things, they didn't have. The Japanese, you could make an argument, they were probably more dangerous to the Japanese in this 3D chess mode than they were together at that point. Eventually, they became, I'd say, more effective, but that first year or two, it was pretty bad because they just, they all of them wanted to be in charge. Everyone wanted to command the battle. Everyone wanted to be the chef. No one wanted to be, the cook or the line cook or whatever. And and that created a bunch of challenges for them.
Hey, Aaron?
Yep.
In what year did Stalin switch his support from the Kuomintang to Mao?
Oh, so that happened pretty early, actually.
I thought it was, I thought it was later. But do you know what year? Was it early 30s?
Yeah, that was I want to say that was 30 or 29. And look, he always liked Mao because I think he saw himself in some way that way. He looked at, but he was let's just say a technical bureaucrat. He wanted to be on the side that he thought could win. And so ultimately, he realized that, Mao had, especially by the Long March, right? Clearly he understood the power of that narrative. Really everyone in the world did. There was when I dug into this, there's enormous press about this, about the Long March, and the significance of it. So a couple of weeks ago, we talked about sort of the Japanese Empire in 37 and their sort of definition of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. In essence, their version of what the Germans wanted in Central Europe for sure, and ultimately Central Eastern Europe, and then everywhere else. But this was Japan's version, which was directly influenced by the Germans. Some areas they were literal translations, just changing the locations but not changing really the reasoning behind it. And of course, this map was not 10 years earlier or 20 years earlier, the map of Japan's possessions or their empire at that point. So, this was a big deal to the world. This was one about the KMT. Sorry, let me go ahead here. All right. So before I kind of go into Manchuria, I know it was a little loose to try to bring these 2-3 pieces together in the chronology, but I didn't really see any other way of doing it except to keep these as completely separate presentations, but then you sort of lose the funneling that's going on across the Pacific, which was really my goal here, was that you could see how Japan was opportunistically taking over either prior colonial possessions or very weak states, basically, and constructing their own, sort of Pacific version of what Germany was constructing for really the same reasons, which were very resource dependent. And it was this vicious cycle where the more possessions they had, the more resources they needed. And consequently, they had to keep expanding further and further to get more resources. What's very fascinating is how few of their leaders, almost none, recognize that sort of absurd paradox, and because they got all these sort of easy wins, they thought that could just continue forever. And we'll get into sort of, pieces of why that didn't work out. I think some people know why at a practical level. So Manchuria, which is a place we don't call it anymore, but very rich then in resources, iron, oil, copper, coal. And Japan, in essence had pieces of it. They wanted all of it, and because they needed it to feed, the domination they wanted to have as they created a Pacific-wide empire. So to create the environment around it, they created what became known as, at least in English, the Manchurian Incident, or the Mukden Incident, which was it's like a Gulf of Tonkin, type event, but I'd say even bigger, which was a staged event that the Japanese military created as a pretext for invading northern China, basically, in 1931. And so the bottom right is the major who actually did it, and his team. They practiced it, and they literally had other railroad ties that were in existence in in another region that they practiced it on, so it would work. And then there's the lieutenant general, who's the overall commander of what became Manchuria, basically, or the Manchurian Japanese forces, the theater forces. Now, the thing to realize that it's so crazy when we talked earlier a couple of weeks ago is that the Japanese leadership in Tokyo sort of signed off on this, but it wasn't really discussed at the strategic level to understand what this commitment was really going to be. It was sort of like just another thing. And what was really discussed was more of the theatrics of, well, if we ever lost face in China, we'd have to respond. There was a lot of that type of discussion. And of course, that fed the environment. They created the environment that when they had this incident, which basically they blew up some railroad ties and, said they were, the guerrillas were targeting Japanese forces. And then that justified a fight, which there was a fight on a bridge. Wasn't very effective. There wasn't really a lot of fighting. And then the whole Japanese army basically invaded. So that's sort of the background to how they got into Manchuria. It's sort of strange. It has, almost a, I'm not going to say it has a direct echo to Vietnam or Afghanistan for the Soviets, but there's, there's traces of similar behavior and hubris there.
Well, not just Afghanistan. I mean, that's what Germans did in Poland, right? They dressed as Polish soldiers, and it was literally like they attacked the tower, and they said, "Well, now we can start the World War II."
Exactly, but I would say this: the big difference was on the other side of it. You had the Russian bear, right? So you did have to be a little more careful. The Japanese at this point in the 30s didn't have anybody in Asia Pacific that challenged them. The only thing that challenged them was their own inertia and some of these sort of agreements they were in that they didn't want to be in, and they were going to break at some point anyways. They just hadn't come to a consensus yet on breaking them. So they created a puppet state, Manchukuo, and they, put a king in, sorry, real quick. Sorry about that.
Just one question, Aaron, John here. I don't know much about this, but I've always wondered, sometimes the Japanese army in Manchuria, they acted independently of the government.
Oh, absolutely.
How unified was the Japanese government at the time?
Pretty ununified. I mean, I think a couple of weeks ago, we talked about just the chaos. This happened, a year before one of their coups d'etats, that they killed a prime minister, which, happened multiple times. It happened 3 times actually in the 20s and 30s, and another 4 attempts. So that wasn't really, the job you wanted to have in Japanese politics. And so and we talked about this a few weeks ago. There was this very, and you see, this has happened in the world, and especially in the 20th century, typically not with large nation states, though. That's what's unique about Japan, where you have a group of very senior leaders, generals, admirals, etc., who don't really have full control over their military, but they can't or try to create the environment to enforce control, because then that exposes that they don't have control. So there becomes this strange sort of kabuki theater that goes on. And then the mid-level officers become really the go-betweens between the typically radical junior officers, right? The people who have, or have salt and vinegar and, hungry to do pretty typically ridiculous things. And that's basically the Japanese military command, to be honest, through the whole war, including in the Pacific against us, or against the US and the Allies. And so they never really solved that. And a big reason why they couldn't is the different classes and different political beliefs that people had between the truly super ultra nationalists, junior officers, who at that point, it was really like a death cult, really, at that point. And then let's say the mid-level officers who were, let's just say, ultra nationalists. And then you had your regular nationalists who were the senior leaders who were trying to, move across the whole field, and had to make sort of compromises and sort of figure out when to be strategic and versus tactical, which the junior officers were sort of, almost like Al-Qaeda, right? They just wanted to run in head first, no matter what, every single time. And you rarely, I mean, there's probably a few examples in history, but you really rarely had a country the size of Japan to have a complete cadre that was that consumed. I mean, even the Germans had a difference between their regular forces and their, in essence, the Nazi party level forces. And the regular forces were much more traditional cadres. And it actually got to an extreme, like the German Navy really sort of operated outside of the full command, or a big part of the full command in Germany in World War II. You didn't have that in Japan, right? I mean, basically the whole junior officer class was committed to Japanese supremacy. So let's see, we talked about this, this sort of event that they create, which then triggers this this conflict, which of course, the Kuomintang wasn't there, but that didn't matter. And then Japan basically, and this is an important thing, that the Japanese military, which was already, because it was so fragmented and there was so many different possessions, the central government really didn't know where all of the Japanese military really was. And that sounds ridiculous, but it's true. So the Japanese army would move its forces really at will. And basically the military just, seized Manchuria. And then of course, Tokyo then sort of had to spin it that, that they're going to create this new state. They take this former emperor, Puyi, I'm probably butchering that, but someone can, correct that, I'd appreciate it. And they make him the leader of the state. And then you have the Japanese at that point kind of start the process of going all in. They invade the port of Shanghai after anti-Japanese incidents, which didn't happen either. And then of course Nanking, appeals to the League of Nations, which I think everyone probably could take a good guess on how that one worked out. And there's a bunch of great reports written, a lot of good paper, a lot of trees, pulp turned into paper on it. So Lord Lytton issues a report to the League and says Japan has unlawful aggression in Manchuria and calls for Japanese forces to withdraw and return it to control. And there's a vote on it, and obviously nothing happens, and that triggers Japan leaving the League of Nations, obviously. So within Japan at this point, we talked a couple weeks ago about how the Japanese military, in essence, takes over Japanese society, down to the schools, down to the institutions, and they just have, it's almost like a veneer or like a user interface, of a political set of leaders who have any sort of power or control when it comes to administrative affairs, and the military itself really runs the country. I mean, there's a bunch of administrative areas in trade and in agriculture, in various forms of, let's say, municipal management, that the civilian leadership still has authority or semi-authority in, but everything when it comes to the power of the state is truly part of the Japanese militarist.
Aaron, I have a question. I apologize.
Yep. Sure.
So, going toward the war with the United States, is it where the situation soured with the United States? Where, go ahead.
Yeah. So we'll get into that. I mean, basically, the invasion of China is where it all changes, and I would say, it's a little weird now to say the invasion of Manchuria and the invasion of China, like they're two different things. And even then, there were people who didn't consider them two different things. But in the world we were in, based on how China was, in essence, had a bunch of colonial possessions, and you had nationalists and communists, there was this sense that there was this concept of a greater China, but within it there were these different regions. And so proper China, which is what I'm talking about now, proper China as of 1937, not today, obviously, is what Japan invaded. And that changed. I mean, the US wasn't like on Japan's side ever in this whole process. We always viewed, and if you remember a couple of weeks ago, we talked about this, the Treaty of Washington, we always viewed as Japan as our major competitor in the Pacific. We generally never viewed conflict with them as either desirable or highly likely until really they invaded what was called China in 1937. And the reason that difference happened is that these other possessions were so, fungible, meaning, whether it was World War I or Treaty of Versailles, so there was movement in them. And then you obviously had the nationalists and communists fighting. So there was just this sense that if one of those possessions moves, but it doesn't change the balance of power too much, well, then that doesn't affect the United States too greatly. It starts to, you have to pay attention to it. You have to get ready, but it doesn't. But when they invade China, that sort of changes, I mean, you could argue World War II sort of starts with the Japanese invasion of China, not, Czechoslovakia or Poland. I mean, or at least it depends on how one wants to define this. I mean, it almost doesn't matter, but given sort of the scale of at that point, in essence, they're trying to take over the whole, what would be called the Chinese Republic and the greater East Asia, in essence, at that point.
Yeah, but it's just weird how I remember reading something that Roosevelt was trying to sell this as an invasion, and the United States public was just, no, we're not buying.
Well, yeah, and I can talk about that too in a little while. The amount of I remember World War I's impact on the United States was tremendous, right? In the biggest way it was tremendous is that it was prior to World War I, the United States had sort of little micro-colonial fights here and there, whether the Spanish-American War, but World War I was a large international engagement, and the American public was not really prepared for that and was not prepared culturally for it, and it really resisted it. I mean, we swung incredibly isolationist in the 1920s. We wanted to have nothing to do with this crazy world outside of our continent and all the crazy things people do in the crazy world. And so that created this sort of, batten down the hatches, barricade ourselves, which is one of the reasons the League of Nations was never ratified by the U.S. Senate. We didn't want to be sucked. It was very, I mean, there was a pretty interesting political philosophy, if you really think about it. What they saw, what the people who are isolationist, in essence, the United States saw was, with the League of Nations, you're trying to create a super version of the balance of power treaty relationships that you had before World War I, that once you flip a switch on each one of them, you start another super war. So they saw the League of Nations as insane because the isolationists viewed it as, well, you're going to have people who are going to start wars, and then that's just going to make a global super war again. So that was the philosophy, which, is maybe not entirely wrong either, but and at an approach in the 1920s, U.S. is just not a world we wanted to be engaged in. And so we saw Japan challenging, in essence, the balance, the status quo in Asia at this point. And of course, sort of the die was cast at that point. Because remember, you can't forget the U.S. Had, substantial presence in the Philippines. So the Philippine Islands We had, major naval forces, major land forces, army forces there. When I say major, I mean corps level, ultimately army level size forces. So that started to put them at risk. And we also understood that when the Japanese invaded China, well, first when they invaded Manchuria for the resources, we knew eventually they'd want to get to the Dutch East Indies, which is below the Philippines. And to get that, they'd have to go through the Philippines. And that starts, the ball rolls down the hill there. So in 37, you could argue in a weird way that the Japanese invasion of Japan, of China, I should say, it was sort of just as stupid as the German invasion of Russia. And when you do sort of the math on the whole war, the Japanese lost between 50 and 75% of the forces they lost in World War II, or the whole war, the whole Pacific War, in China. So, it's almost like now China could never have defeated Japan. They could never have invaded Japan. Japan would have just had to retreat itself into some state that is sustainable, because the losses that the Japanese had from a combination of the nationalists and the communists and locals, I mean, just local warlords and just local people were astronomical. Well over, really a couple million people really in the Japanese forces over, a 15-year period. And it's something I think most people don't fully appreciate is they, so this, let me pump all this in here. I don't, I talked a little bit about the rape of Nanking or Nanjing. It wasn't the only place they did something like this. It's probably the largest place they did something like this, where over a course of, less than a month, somewhere in the order of, probably close to 500,000 civilians were killed. And with a level of brutality, that definitely falls back into the time of the Mongols and Middle Ages and maybe even before that. So, the Japanese did versions of this hundreds of times, not to that scale, but definitely within an order of magnitude smaller. Tens of thousands was pretty regular. They had a very similar to the Germans' view of Asian peoples in terms of who was the best and why and who wasn't, and it was very dehumanizing, obviously. And the Chinese were clearly pretty low on that list.
When did that racialist ideology appear? I mean, it's very strange when you think about it, is that the Japanese, they borrowed the writing system from the Chinese. They always looked up to China, and a lot of the early literature was in Chinese. Why? I mean, the Romans never did this to the Greeks.
So
what happened with the Japanese?
We talked a couple of weeks ago about how the Japanese evolved their codes culturally into this extreme Japanese nationalism, and that really started in the let's say, it was, I'm sure, already there even before the 1860s and 70s, but as they modernized and and built more modern writing systems and approaches to distributing information, it sort of exploded into the 1900s, 1910s, 20s, and then really in the 20s, the ultra-nationalists in the 20s, the extreme militant versions, they were, just as insane as, as the craziest Germans were about their racial superiority in Asia. And as I said earlier, that young officers population, which was, becoming, ultimately, it got reconstituted because the education system had it pumped into it for, better part of a decade. So, you got new generations of young officers who had that thinking, and then the prior generation became the mid-tier officers, and maybe they smoothed some of their edges, but they still had that underlying belief of Japanese superiority. So that's really where it came from. And we talked, Hadrian had, a couple of weeks ago when he talked about the Bushido Code and just how that developed. That wasn't just sort of marketing, So anyways, up to this point, any questions? I know it's a lot of sort of setting the table, and that's what a lot of these last couple of presentations have been. And apologize, it's not just 75 battles, because there's so many of these battles. I just think they all.
The comment that I'll make about it is it seems so unplanned, right? It seems
absolutely
like the events were driving events without anybody thinking through what it meant.
That's exactly, you're 100% right. You could argue this was just Japan society tumbling through these events and, different clans and groups fighting each other to gain some power. Once they did, they opportunistically took advantage of that power, and it just kept going, and they just kept doing it. And then anyone that was rational, compromising, democratic, any of these sort of behaviors was just pushed to the side or killed.
How much of an effect that the Japanese had drew from, Germans obviously overstepping the League of Nations and claiming Sudetenland, all that stuff. Did they draw any comparison?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they started having communications with the Germans. So, another one of these just weird things in history that basically when in 32 the prime minister was assassinated. I mean, basically the Germans, Hitler and the German power machine took over about the same time that the Japanese nationalists took over, or started to take over, right? So they started to take over in 32, 33, and then they fully took over by 36. So they started communications in 33, and then by 36 they had it was strange. I mean, they had some communications. They never really had a lot of communications through the whole war. It was the weirdest. I mean, strange way. They never realized, I think, I really do believe this, that Japan and Germany never realized how the world really changed when the United States came in and fought a two-front war and had this industrial capacity that was incredible, that basically fueled an enormous amount of both sides of that two-front war. And there's a lot of background noise. Is somebody not on mute?
Debbie, can you put a mute on, please? Sorry. So it's interesting, the aspect of it is, Debbie, can you mute your line, please? Thank you so much. The interesting aspect is United States had initially steered their, I guess, war politics toward helping Western powers to defeat Hitler. And, they were never, or they didn't really steer it toward Japan,
Well, what you have to realize is that when we started to engage the Western European powers, we really, and I can talk about this too. We passed a bunch of laws that basically tried to enforce our neutrality because we didn't want to get dragged in, right? And one of the ways we felt we were going to get dragged in is if we either overtly or covertly supported one of the belligerents. Now, eventually that sort of fell apart, but it took quite a while. It took through pretty much the whole 30s. It took over 5 years for that to happen. And so we were really almost delaying the inevitable internally because we were still incredibly isolationist at that point throughout the 30s. And remember, we were in the middle of a Great Depression. The idea that we were going to spend resources on all these crazy wars that somehow we were going to get dragged into, didn't seem that rational. And, I could probably understand that if it's 1935 America and, it's a pretty brutal place here, if you're in the Dust Bowl or you're in the South or you're pretty much almost anywhere that, you have food lines and you have, 20% plus in unemployment. The idea that we were going to drag ourselves into, some war somewhere else, it just had no support. I mean, it had a small little bit of support from intellectuals and sort of the people who supported the idea of a League of Nations, et cetera. But overall, it literally polled nothing. 10%, whatever. So this is sort of the chronology of, let's just say, all the different events that happened. And I said there was, based on the Manchurian Railroad event, the Mukden incident, 31, 32, U.S. issue. So the U.S. starts to, when I say get involved, we get involved by passing laws to say don't get involved. That's how we started to get involved. So now part of the challenge is, we almost locked ourselves in our own physics of getting involved. So we issue the Stemson non-recognition doctrine, which is in essence, anyone that invades a sovereign state, we will not recognize that state under control of that other state, and then we will not recognize that state that did the invasion. That was the sort of tweak that was a little more dangerous than the people who wrote it understood. Now there's this debate whether they really knew they were doing this, and I don't believe that. I think they were, I think they just, didn't realize this is what other people were going to interpret it as. Japan leaves the League of Nations, obviously, because the Lytton a report comes out that says, hand it back, and the Japanese are, no, we're not, and that's that. We talked about the Second United Front established in China, so now you really have this full-blown war that the Japanese basically walked themselves into at this point, and given the militarist and saving face, and then obviously the Japanese military did not believe that the Chinese, they so misread the scale of Chinese support against the Japanese and the fact that they can materially fight. That was the piece that the Japanese never fully appreciated. They really never appreciated that through the whole war. Including into 45, when there were Japanese commanders in China still really fighting this other war that had nothing to do with us, a little bit because we had bombers and sort of some guerrilla fighters, et cetera, but overall really had nothing to do with us, that wanted to keep fighting the war, that didn't want to surrender. Obviously that wasn't going to happen, but now what starts to happen, and this is where we start pulling ourselves in. So Japan sinks the USS Panay in 37, which I'll talk about a little bit. That could have really triggered us into World War II that early. The Navy, though, did not feel we were ready to fight a war, in China, you know, which they were right. We weren't ready. But what the U.S. did is we started the process, right? The you could say the Lend-Lease process, which happened later to Britain. We started that actually with, you know, the Chinese, with, you know, with the nationalists. And so then the U.S. puts an embargo on Japan, and we cancel our trade deal because we had a lot of trade in steel, right? U.S. obviously was a steel superpower then. So we cut them off really completely from all their critical materials that they needed to support their expanding empire, especially their military. And then, of course, it starts to spiral after that. So that's sort of the chronology. We'll get into sort of the details behind it. Any questions on this? This is sort of high level. There's
Aaron, may I ask you a question?
Sure.
What's your view on Roosevelt's, I would say, behavior that all these latest steps before Pearl Harbor, that he was doing this intentionally to put Japan in the corner to make it to attack US, because it was the only way US could enter the World War because of the Congress, situation in the Congress.
Yeah, I mean, I that's the you know, I call that the Roswell UFO theory of Pearl Harbor. I mean, it's just there's no facts to support that. The idea of a president, you know, I mean, independent of people who are way out there thinking that a president's going to set up you know, some type of massive strike against your own resources that are absolutely critical to your success. And no, I mean, the simple answer is Roosevelt was fighting internally a 5-front war to try to just get us to get prepared. People don't realize the isolationists weren't just preventing us from engaging with other countries. They were not voting for a larger defense budget also. I mean, they did not want the US to build up its way to fight. So he was, you know, but there were some isolationists that were okay with some buildup. There were, you know, let's say more internationalists that wanted diplomatic approaches, but not any sort of buildups. There were some that wanted both. I mean, so, you know, he had this very complex relationship at a cabinet level, you know, with the Senate, with the House, even with governors, you know, because, you know, you needed, if you're going to build a base or expand a base, you needed support, you know, from governors. Some of them, you know, were isolationists. So, you know, he had roadblocks. It's almost amazing what he did to even get us in the situation we were in by 41, that we could even start the process to really expand. So really by 39.
Yeah.
In 40,
Aaron?
election.
Oh.
Go ahead. Sorry.
There was also an election in 1940, so he had to overcome all this resistance, which and obviously mobilizing forces. It was very unpopular, so he had to deal on both fronts. I believe he realized that we need to go into the war, but he couldn't afford doing this just on his own.
Absolutely. So he actually lied in 1940, like lied, like real old-fashioned, your 5-year-old kid tells you a lie, you know, to the American people, and to, you know, a whole bunch of people, that we were positioning ourselves to get ready to go to war, because he, you know, eventually, you know, we didn't have the same political, you know, election process that we've had the last 50, 60, 70 years, or 60 plus years. So you didn't have sort of debates the same way, you know, you didn't have, you know, it was sort of parallel campaigns. And, but you were surrounded by, you know, like literally a constellation of reporters, you know, launching a zillion questions to you. And, you know, sometimes you wouldn't answer most of them, but if those questions sort of piled up and the newspaper reporters wrote about, he won't answer, he won't do this, and that takes off, well, then guess what? You have to start answering that. And then he would invite, you know, 10 reporters to talk for 2-3 hours and, you know, basically say something's on the record, something's off the record. So that was this 1940 political campaign. It's great you brought that up, because every time he was trying to push us to get ready for something, there was another political dimension that he had to sort of back off and take his foot off the gas. Go ahead,
Aaron?
Yes.
Yeah, I was just going to say another element that reinforces, you know, the idea that it's kind of ridiculous to think Roosevelt, you know, knew Pearl Harbor was going to happen and let it happen, is that our intelligence was way off, ours and the Brits, with regard to specifically the Japanese Navy. We had cracked their diplomatic codes, but we had not cracked their Japanese Navy. We didn't even have the Japanese Navy properly placed geographically. And everybody knew they were building, they did know that they were building up to attack somewhere. But the Brits had pretty much focused that was going to be at some of the oil, you know, rich areas in the South China Sea. And so we were, you know, just totally blindsided, obviously. It was nobody's fault in a way. I mean, intelligence then wasn't what intelligence is now, and there were language problems, and the Japanese had some very good codes. They also did practical things, like the whole Japanese Navy that was subsequently attacked Pearl Harbor went radio dead.
That's right.
You know, they did everything right for doing something wrong.
No, I mean, look, and we're not going to be able to talk about Pearl Harbor today, but you know, that's really its own presentation. But you know, you could argue, you know, the attack on Pearl Harbor and then the subsequent wave over those first 90 days, you know, was as powerfully successful a campaign as any in history, you know, outside of, you know, maybe a couple of the Mongol campaigns, but it's right up there with Hannibal. I mean, it's just it's a tour de force, all up and down the command. I mean, it speaks to, you know, if you look at who organized that, right? Yamamoto, right? Someone who went to Harvard, someone who spent years in the U.S., someone who was not very nationalist. I mean, everyone had to be somewhat nationalist at minimum. That was like being a radical leftist almost, is to be minimally nationalist, right? So, but he was not a hard, crazy, off the rails, you know, super ultra nationalist. And so he understood everything that was going to happen after we attacked. You know, and that's why his goal was to have a devastating attack and knock our whole naval forces out. So you bring up a great point about the Japanese naval code. So almost every planner logically assumed that if we were going to be attacked, we were going to be attacked at the Philippines. It made sense, which we ultimately were attacked in the Philippines, but it was after Pearl Harbor. So the Philippines made all the sense because we had airfields there, we had our Navy there, we had you know, a force the size of an army, basically 2 corps. So you know, it had all the signatures that were very logical. And given how the Japanese had fought already, you know, where they basically have a reinforced invasion, the Philippines just made sense. And the way they attacked in the Philippines, you know, ultimately, you know, is exactly what we thought they would do. Pearl Harbor was so unique because just the innovation was unique. right, leading with a carrier task force, was so radical. I mean, it would be the equivalent today. I really do believe this. It's the equivalent of a nation launching an end-to-end cyber assault on another nation, top to bottom. And I don't mean Russia against Estonia, like that kind of differential, but I mean, let's say near peer, just launching, a total, 50,000 hackers trying to, rip apart your other country, top to bottom, every network, every node. I mean, that's like TV shows and movies and things like that. But, I don't think anybody in the world thinks another country actually is going to do that and is preparing to stop that. I think everyone's preparing to stop that as part of some other combination of 40, 50 attack vectors. But hitting us with all those carriers was literally that radical. So to answer the question on Pearl Harbor, it really did come out of left field in terms of what made sense at that time. The other thing we did not understand, and great point you made, is we didn't understand the disposition of the Japanese forces throughout Asia. And let's be real, I mean, the old government 5 years earlier didn't know where they were either. So, it was the Japanese, and to be really honest, many people in the Japanese military didn't know where they were. I mean, the Japanese sort of ran this almost chaos factory across all their different forces in different regions. They sort of gelled them together when they wanted to attack. And you bring up the naval codes, which they had a series of naval codes that we classified as JN, which, Japanese naval. And the JN series from JN 11 all the way through 167, we eventually broke, the key one was JN 25. And once we broke that one, then we were able to understand that they were going to come to attack Midway. And understand they were looking to invade Midway. So, that was not even a Pearl Harbor style attack. So I put this up right now because I thought this was pretty good about, sort of our reasons for our isolationism and sort of all the pieces and how they sort of, fed each other. And we talked about all these. And understand how the U.S. felt about our interests then. Right.
Aaron, just to clarify one thing, when I was asking about Roosevelt's approach to this, I don't mean that he knew and lied that he didn't know about Pearl Harbor. Obviously, it was beyond probably his or anybody's abilities. But looking at steps he did to corner Japan into the corner,
yeah,
he inevitably brought the probability of attack to almost 100%. Not knowing where and when it happens, but he forced it to do this.
Well, I mean, look, at the end of the day, Japan is the one who attacked, right? I mean, he didn't force the Japanese to attack. So at the end of the day, the Japanese are the ones that were building this out of control, sort of empire that needed to consume more resources and wanted to maintain the prior relationships regardless of the empire they were building. And that, almost under all circumstances anywhere in the world, that violates the ability to maintain your treaties. I mean, just at a simple level, it gets pretty hard to in essence, the Japan wanted to build this new order in all of East Asia, which, it looked like they were going to do. The other thing you have to realize is we were really not ready to fight the war as it looked in 37, 38, and 39, right? The training we had, the lack of modern equipment, the logistics that was needed. We were still, people forget we had another sort of mini depression, very bad recession, basically in 37, 38 again. you know, which luckily didn't last, you know, as long as the 29 to like 33 did, 34. But you know, we weren't on great footing at that point, you know, to be really honest.
As I remember, the standing army was only 16,000 men in the late 30s.
Yeah, I mean that was so. Yeah, I mean
and Eisenhower was stuck as a colonel for many years.
Oh, absolutely. No, I mean when you look at you know, whether it's General Marshall, who was a 1-star, or Eisenhower, who was a colonel, or Patton and Bradley, all the sort of American commands that were pretty mid-senior grade officers, you know, that later became, you know, 4 and 5 stars. You know, we didn't have the developed infrastructure of the war of the fighting force that we ultimately had in World War II. The one interesting thing we did have, and this was a huge advantage that the Japanese never recognized, and I mean Yamamoto recognized some of it, but even he got this wrong, is our unity of command was very strong in the Navy. We had all those naval commanders. The full modernization of our fleet wasn't done yet, but the fleet modernization had already started, right? So we were already building carriers, we were building destroyers. We had, you know, like the superstar commanders, you know, Mishner, Nimitz, Sprunis, Halsey, King, et cetera, you know, like the Zhukovs of the ocean, basically. You know, they were organizing battle fleets. So, you know, you could say the Japanese had a terrible miscalculation on all kinds of fronts, but one of them was that if they didn't knock out our complete Navy in Pearl Harbor and around Pearl Harbor and where the fleets were in other places in the Philippines and across the Pacific, and they didn't stop, you know, the Panama Canal, they were ultimately going to face this building Navy that was going to swing back, you know, very similar to the way the Soviet land forces did. And the Japanese never truly recognized. In many ways, they still thought we were the Navy governed by the Treaty of Washington. But once all the other countries sort of, you know, flew out of the Treaty of Washington, then we just flew out also. They did not have that intelligence. And that was a huge miscalculation on their part. They basically thought our forces were about half the size that they really were. And worse, this was the biggest error. They thought our building was only about 10% of what we had. So they really
Can I ask a question?
Yep.
Returning to the previous argument, but by the time U.S. imposed the oil embargo, don't you think they forced Japanese hand by that time? Because they had no choice; they would collapse. The economy would collapse.
I mean, so when you say force their hand, I mean, look, you know, at what point, game theory wise, are you forced to attack someone that can put you at existential risk, which at that point, the U.S. was the only nation that could put, the U.S. and the Soviet Union were the only 2 threats that Japan had in the world. And I think everyone acknowledges that. So the Japanese could somehow figure out how not to create that situation with the Soviet Union. That's a little battle they had, which hopefully, I mean, we can go into that. By the way, there's a lot of background noise. I don't know if somebody. Someone go on mute.
Oh shit! How did that keep?
Okay. All right. Let me see if I can mute. I don't like muting because then I have to go back and forth, and it's sort of.
He's muted.
Sorry?
She's already muted.
Okay, good. All right, let me get rid of this. So, so we talk about the, you know, the Japanese conquest here. This is the Yangtze River.
Can we pursue Greg's question for a second?
Oh, sure, of course.
I mean, there's some simple math, right? I mean, if you calculate that the country's industries are going to shut down because you've cut off oil, then that had to be known
to the people who were establishing the embargo, and they probably communicated that they were gonna, that was a threat that they would do to the Japanese. So.
Okay, but I mean, if the reason,
Was there a bluff that was called?
No, it wasn't a bluff. It was, I mean, this was pretty simple. At the end of the day, if Japan is invading more countries, needs more resources, how does it make sense to continue to feed that when it just doesn't make any sense? I mean, how is that our fault, I guess, at that point?
No, I mean, I'm saying it's Japan's folly.
Oh, yeah, it's totally Japan's folly. Of course it is.
But the question is at the point that, that becomes an existential threat to Japan. It basically says, okay, now you have to back down, or we're at war. You're going to collapse.
Now realize, and the USS Panay was a very important incident in Japanese psychology. So you actually bring up something really important about their reading of us or misreading of us, which was pretty substantial. So they sunk, this was an old, World War I, it's an insult to destroyers to call it a destroyer. It's basically a, 1910s riverboat that, had a few guns on it. And the Japanese just directly sunk it. We turned in a pretzel. It was a great job by FDR. He did not. The U.S. Navy. There was of course a group in the U.S. Navy that said we have to respond and blah blah blah. And then there was a group that said, well, we can respond proportionally. And there was another group that said, well, we could respond in some other way. And FDR, the way he read all that is basically, because I think he was a phenomenal manager when you really boil it down. He ultimately read all that saying, well, guys, that just says we're not ready. Like, I don't care what your answers are. It just doesn't add up to us being ready to do something. And so, he basically demands an apology, sends them a bill. They pay the bill. The Japanese laugh at us, basically. And they viewed that as enormous weakness and loss of face, and that we would always back down. So that's that. And so that incident was really important for that reason. And of course it feeds to what we talked about earlier. We were not ready, 4 years early. This is 4 years before Pearl Harbor. So we were not ready for, the conflict at that point anyways. But we also didn't want one of these triggering events, right? And it was, Secretary Stimson had a great point, and he said, the Panay looks a lot like a floating version of the Archduke of Ferdinand, and it was just like a great line. I always thought that was a great line. It's like, is this what we want to start World War II over? And I think that was pretty accurate. And so, but this was a big deal, but it's still, and this is why FDR was such a good reader of where we were. This didn't move our isolationism at all. It just didn't. It just didn't move it. And so he knew, okay, this isn't going to do it. A couple things about the Japanese government. So there's earlier questions about the Japanese government. And then we'll get into one of my favorite battles in history. We'll get into next, but we got a few minutes left. So in the Japanese government, there were two factions. There was the northern faction, which was led by the army, which was nuts because they wanted to invade Soviet Union. Good luck with that. And the southern faction, which was led by the Navy, which wasn't nuts. They were just miscalculating and sort of delusional, which is, I guess, less than being totally crazy. And they wanted to move south into the Dutch East Indies, which made a lot of sense, especially as the Germans, were ultimately, intimating of creating this larger sort of German space that, the Dutch weren't going to stop. And so the Navy wanted to be ready to take advantage of that. or to just lead with it because they knew the Dutch couldn't stop them. And so these two factions, after the invasion of China, sort of fought each other. And like I said, there wasn't really a government in that civilian sense, right? So it was Tojo and the kind of the Big Six War Committee. And it was sort of who had the last best idea sometimes, and, or who tried something, did it work a little bit, let's keep going. So there wasn't this dominant strategy. Ultimately, the army, because after, at this point, 7, 8, 9 years, the army just couldn't slug its way through China. I mean, and so the idea that you're going to triple or quadruple what you were already fighting just, didn't make any sense, because the amount of commitment the Japanese would need would be 2 or 3 times of the forces they already had at that point in China, which were well over 1 million, on their way to 2 million. So that's something to sort of recognize where the Japanese were. And then my favorite battle, and then for my good Russian friends here, you can help me properly pronounce it. So the Battle of
Khalkhin-Gol.
I'm sorry?
Khalkhin-Gol.
Okay, Khalkhin-Gol.
No, Halkin. Halkhin-Gol, yeah.
Okay, Halkhin-Gol. Thank you.
Yeah.
Halkhin-Gol. So I could do a whole presentation on this battle. I love it. It's just got all of the it's just fantastic. I recommend.
Tell me who was the guy who was in charge, and everything is be told from there.
That's all it is. Well, so here's the key. So before he was in charge, we'll get to him in a second, there were 4 incompetent Soviet generals who fought each other more than they fought the Japanese, which the Japanese took advantage of. And then the Soviet War Committee, took this pretty interesting armor commander who had these crazy ideas of pulling all the different forces together and create really combined arms. And this is truly the first modern combined arms battle in the world, in history. There were versions in World War I, but they were, sort of piecemeal. They weren't integrated. So this interesting kind of guy that maybe no one's heard of, General Zhukov, took over as the 57 Corps commander, and in 2 weeks whipped them into shape, 75,000 strong, plus another 10, 15,000 that were auxiliary. And then over 90 days, just basically smashed the Japanese in 6 battles. And this is the reason, and most people do not understand this. This is the actual heart of the reason why the Japanese never were going to invade the Soviet Union, was after this. They understood that the Soviets were not the Russians that they had fought, 30 plus years earlier. And all of their arrogance they had about who they thought the Russians were and how great the Japanese thought they were, that was clearly proven was not the case. And then, of course, but the Soviets also just didn't believe that either, right? The Soviets kept an enormous force on the east after this battle because they thought, okay, well, this
40 divisions.
40 divisions,
yeah.
Which, let's back up. For the Soviets, that's not a massive force. That's a mid-sized force, so it's all relative, but it's still large enough. And then eventually they were able to peel off about 30 odd to bring west, and actually more, because they actually built these large bases there where they took on local populations into the force. So ultimately they moved over 40, I think it was 44 divisions to the west, which was, and the key was they moved those 44 divisions in a critical period. That was the key, right? They were able to move them in 41, 42, which was absolutely essential. Because those forces could backfill, in the larger salients that after they pushed the Germans out of, Stalingrad, or let them die there, basically, and Leningrad. The Soviets could bring forces from Moscow and south of Russia and then these forces could go in 20 divisions each and backfill. That was a really big deal because then they could create overwhelming power at those key junctures in those key battles. And it's all tied back to this battle here. It's a fantastic battle to look at. It's not well studied. There's a few US, a few old Russian research, like War College type papers, which is what I read it from. I can send those out to people if you're interested. It's really amazing. The leaders, kind of Zhukov, the manager Zhukov was, you really see who he was in this. He doesn't go in and humiliate, generals and colonels. I mean, he basically has this, we got to get this done. We'll talk about what happened later. I mean, that's basically what he does.
Aaron, no, not Zhukov, but Zhukov.
Oh, I'm sorry, Zhukov. Yeah, that's another one of those things. It's hard for, I think, some Americans.
If I might add another note, when Zhukov got the summons to Moscow to receive the assignment, he thought he was going straight to the Lubyanka, so he sent a farewell letter to his wife.
Yes,
he met Stalin, and he was.
Well, no, he had no idea that this is what they, basically this was the significant promotion and catapult of his career. I mean, it really was, because after this, he doesn't really stop. I mean, actually, the only time he stops is when he gets so big and so good that, Stalin luckily doesn't kill him, but, basically tries to not sort of manage him. Right. I mean, I always thought that's a very interesting thing to study is sort of, I love him as a figure because over history, he's just such an interesting person.
Stalin?
No, Zhukov. No, I mean Zhukov is, because he doesn't really have this superstar life after World War II.
No, he was sent as a governor of Odessa Oblast, which is the Odessa, region.
Yep.
And he was a nobody, basically.
He was a nobody, and they were always afraid that he was such a magnifying figure, and he was so authentic that he was dangerous, right? And
well, he was so big that when Khrushchev, who was after Stalin, came to the United States and met Harry Truman.
Yep.
At the time, Harry Truman gave him the fishing harness for Zhukov, particularly. Said, please give it to my favorite guy in Russia.
He was a rock star here. Even during the Cold War, when we realized, obviously we were fighting the Soviet Union, many of which were future generals or generals, marshals that were in World War II. Zhukov always maintained a special place because we recognize, his contribution. I mean, the best analysis I've ever seen, and it's really great. I'll try to dig it up. I saw it years ago. Basically compared him to General Grant. And I've always liked that. Just his calmness, his rationale, his sort of management approach. I mean, he just, all hell could be breaking loose, and he's just, he's just this calm, steady figure, and which freaked other people out, obviously, especially people that competed with him.
It's interesting you mentioned Grant, because the knock against Zhukov is he didn't care about casualties, and that's
Grant didn't either
against Grant.
Yeah, that was the exact same charge that Grant did. And by the way, Zhukov's favorite U.S. Commander to ever study was General Grant in the Civil War. So he looked at Grant's campaigns west to east, in a very similar way. I mean, I've always thought there's some kind of telepathic love there between those two, and their personalities and everything else, and just the way they managed on the battlefield, the way they took it. Grant was a nobody also, so and basically until Shiloh. So Shiloh was sort of that first battle that said, oh wow, the North has something no one thought they had, and this is very similar here with Hawk and Gold. So there's a great video on this. I can put stuff up for nerds on this later if people are interested. But this is sort of the summary of the hell that was happening in 40-41. So people forget that the fleet only moved to Hawaii in May of 40, the Pacific Fleet. Prior to that, most of the fleet was docked in the U.S. in San Diego and basically on the West Coast, or was in the East Coast and had to come through the canal, the Panama Canal. And so we had built Hawaii's Pearl Harbor, talking about what we talked about a couple of weeks ago from Mahan's perspective. That was ultimately our naval platform was Hawaii. And then we looked at our little islands and ultimately the Philippines as really our support system throughout the Pacific. But these were all the different things that were going on. And one that's very interesting that most people, I didn't know this till I read about it. So the Vichy government, when France fell, acceded to Japan's request for bases in southern Indochina. So, they moved into northern French Indochina, but they were able to take over all of Indochina, within a year or so, about a year and a half. So, they were in essence surrounding the South Pacific. And it was most people believe, most planners at that time believed that their energy was going to be the invasion in the South Pacific all the way down through Australia, which that was what the Navy wanted to do also. But they had to, their major risk in the ocean was us, just like their major risk on land was the Soviets. But they already figured out that they're not going to fight the Soviets. So then we're the only game left in town. And this is this goes into their occupation down here of Indochina. And it gives you this view of, here's the Philippines, if everyone can see. Can everyone see my cursor or no?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So there's the Philippines, which we had we had a full army there, and we had a fairly decent sized Navy task force. The big thing we had in the Philippines is we were sort of using it as a land aircraft carrier, right? We had an enormous amount of the Army Air Corps, right? There wasn't the U.S. Air Force yet. That didn't happen until basically after the war. But so the Air Corps was in the Army then. So you had really two air forces then. You had the Navy, which had its own Air Force as part of the carriers. That was brand new as a concept. So that was still sort of theoretical. And then you had the Army Air Corps, which is where the majority of air power was. And of course, we weren't going to give up the Philippines, right? I mean, that was, and we really believed and also realized who was the commander there, right? That was MacArthur. So we had our own funky version of a hubris going on a little bit. And MacArthur was larger than life, too. So, you weren't going to really rattle that cage if on our end, we weren't going to move him out. He was sort of a rock star. I mean, it's sort of, there's really not a parallel in the modern world really to MacArthur. I mean, MacArthur's kind of a throwback, that's what they used to call him, American Caesar. I mean, he really was strangely like a legion general, in the Roman, that commanded one of the legion groups that is like 4 legions. I mean, he was really that sort of large of a figure. And we sort of assumed that meant meant something to the Japanese, which it really didn't. They didn't respect us. They thought every time, that basically we were all talk. And if we were ever pushed, we would back down, and like the USS Panay incident. And ultimately, what the Japanese wanted was down here. This is where all the oil was, all of it. I mean, a lot of it. Let's put it that way, an enormous amount of it, and other resources, rubber. I mean, everything. It was, but they knew you can't go here without going here, right? I mean, so you had to go to the Philippines, or you had to deal with the Philippines if you're going to go into the Dutch East Indies. And of course, once you get into the Dutch East Indies, you can jump into Australia. So, which was, there was a faction, there was a naval faction that wanted that invasion. The army didn't really want the invasion of Australia, but not for what the reason you would think it is. It's for the teenage kind of moronic competition reason. It wasn't that to do that would require the Japanese Navy. You could argue the Japanese Navy and the Japanese Army was almost in as much competition as they were with their outside belligerents. They were really two worlds in Japan. Culturally, there were two worlds that never really saw eye to eye. So that's Camaran Bay, which is Japan's oil lifeline. But you're dealing with the Philippines, and obviously you're within U.S. aircraft strike. So, so this is sort of the rest of the pieces building up at this point. So they declare kind of the 2.0 version of the co-prosperity sphere. They formed their tripartite pact, which was completely useless. We slap iron and steel embargo on them. Obviously, the oil embargo comes next in the next year. Can
I just add some quickly, Aaron? Sorry.
Yeah,
so
I know we got to run, so this is sort of leads up the beast.
Okay, so let me finish, but I just wanted to mention quickly, when there was a pact between Italy, Germany, and Japan, the only way that either of their powers get involved, which is Japan or Germany, is when essentially only Soviet Union or the United States attacks any of those three countries.
Yes,
and
you're completely correct. And so the thing you have to realize at the end of the day, Germany saw the U.S. as sort of a philosophical threat, not a direct threat, because obviously we're not on the Eurasian, or especially Western Eurasia. We're not in Europe. I always hate when people call Europe a continent, because it's not, right? It's part of Eurasia, but that's always this goofy thing whenever I see people, and everyone writes, like all newspaper people always do that. But anyway, that's like a sidebar, sorry.
Then let me just also interrupt. Aaron, I think, and if you correct me if I'm wrong, I want to set up a Q&A session on only this.
Sure.
Like it's such a big topic. I didn't realize how humongous this is.
It just goes on.
And you know what?
On.
And it's lovely. I mean, I mean, everybody in here is absolutely mesmerized and staying and all that stuff. And we're just running out a little bit of time. So what do you think about, I can move, not the next presentation, we're still going to do Russian front, but, right after that, I think we have like one of the Cold Wars or something like that. I have to take a look.
Yeah, you can, if you want, you can bump my Cold War and we could push that to some other time, and then we could just keep rolling.
Yeah, I love it, because then at least you're on the roll.
Yeah.
And you already have a presentation going.
Yeah.
That just for that sake. I mean, if you want to finish up a little bit.
Yeah, the last couple things I'll finish up with, which, we always hear this sort of narrative about, the U.S. could, expand dramatically and we're an engine manufacturing and all this, but we really look at, this is why what Japan did was so insane, right? I mean, Japan was basically economically France or Italy at that point. And, where we were economically, even back in 38, we were still 4 times, almost 5 times bigger than Japan. So most of their decisions they made had nothing to do with sort of this rational view of the instruments of power that was your potential. They viewed it almost in this sort of, tough guy, prison yard sort of TV show like Honor Code, that, you know what, the Americans, you can punk them, right? They didn't sort of add up the math here that says, well, if we've got basically, more, basically the same GDP that almost everyone in the, or maybe only like maybe a third of the world's GDP at that point, basically. They just didn't. They just couldn't connect the dots there. I mean, they really couldn't. And what's really amazing is how stable this was for all the other countries on average, except the U.S., who basically doubled during that period, which tells you how much slag there was really in the U.S. economy, which was another thing they didn't recognize. The thing people didn't get, and FDR got this, the 37-38 recession, which is almost a depression, really. You could argue it sort of was like a mini depression. Kind of like what we just went through or still going through. I mean, it was that violent. I mean, it was devastating. Made us look weaker than we really were. And so we sort of slungshot back in, and then coming out of that, we started our, not secret, but let's just say less overt war production, which was the way we did it was very smart. Because remember, FDR was a Navy guy. So he led with the Navy. He almost always did that anyways. But in this case, he really did that. And naval ships are weird sort of economic instruments, right? Even then, right? They cost a lot of money to make, no matter when you make them in the last, 100 years, really. They take a long time, and they just keep getting fed. And so he really kind of understood, and the Secretary of the Navy, obviously, and all those people understood that you could prepare 20, 50, 70 ships, and you could create a lot of jobs, and you could build, and obviously coastal, but then it started feeding into the center of the country as you make other things, right? You make these big guns, those big guns made with, all kinds of different forms of steel. Those are being made in Detroit and Pittsburgh, and, in essence, the Rust Belt, that we call the Rust Belt today. So that's just one other little piece. So this is sort of the whole point of like, what else did they miss, right? So, and then let's see, the last thing I'd like to quickly go over is just a couple interesting things. So they had this plan, which was 3,000 miles of East Asian Empire, and then eventually 4,000 and 5,000. Right, so the scale of this thing is astronomical, right? I mean, it was really taking over Asia, is really the theory they had. Which, there was a handful of craziest Germans that thought they could actually take over, all of Europe and Eurasia. I mean, yeah, sure, there was a handful of people, but that wasn't up and down the complete German high command, right? But in Japan, this was really the thought, was that they could, in essence, conquer all of Asia, or, the whole Asian Pacific, kick out all the European powers, push the US aside. So we talked about this. And so the oil embargo was a very big deal. They were dependent on the US for 80% of their oil, which, when you really think about that, was really insane. Number one, that they sustained that they didn't go get other possessions and start transitioning that. I mean, so they were living this sort of weird duality, right? Like those people the best analogy I have for this, or there's a really great historian that talked about this. It's almost like those strange guys that have two families, and then they get caught, and they like wonder how that happened. It's like the Japanese were dependent completely on us for their oil. Their whole power was based on oil. At some point, that something was going to give there, and what was going to give was not us. Even if we weren't going to fight them directly, we were going to stop, allowing them to have access to oil, to have access to natural resources. So, and I'll leave it there, because the rest of this goes into the real,
Can I ask one question?
Sure. Yeah, please.
Yeah, is it really the Japanese ambitions to conquer all those countries? Is it really so fantastical? Because if you think about it, most of those countries were occupied powers by Britain, France, and one other, I can't remember.
Dutch. The Dutch.
Dutch, yeah. So, if they would be preoccupied with the war in Europe.
I mean, so that's a fair question. I would say if they never invaded China, I think you're 100% right. But the fact that they, were burning, let's say half their army, at least, really is 2/3 in China, and really not getting anywhere either. Right. I mean, it wasn't working after 8-9 years. And they would just keep feeding the beast, and it was like, I mean, this was their Vietnam, but 100 times bigger, really, in some ways. And so the idea that you still do that and you try to wipe out all these colonial possessions and control them and create a new status quo. So remember, that's the key here, right? It's not that you can't just take something over, but you have to enforce a new status quo by any other power, right? And so that's the piece that was fantastical, is that not that they couldn't take, I mean, this is where the fantastical piece came in, which is, you could say they were rational enough to know that they could take on and take over those colonial possessions, but that they could maintain them and sustain them. This goes into their war theory. Their war theory is they wanted to make this whole war finish in 6 months, which, you had cabinet meetings, or the big six would sit there for a 2-hour meeting, talk an hour and 45 minutes on basically why they're getting their ass kicked in China, and nothing's changing, and then talk 15 minutes about how they can win the whole war in the rest of the Pacific in 6 months, and it'll work out for them. And in theory, that might have been possible, but they were still going to fight the Chinese for 1,000 years, right? I mean, that's really the heart of the whole issue, is that China was in a lot of ways the Soviet version of what it was to the Germans. They had this delusion and this arrogance and the ego that thought that they sort of, were magically superior just because they were Japanese. And we studied that a couple of weeks ago. So I think that's the piece that makes it fantastical.
Aaron, could you give just like a quick numerical breakdown, percentage of the Chinese resistance that was run by the communists versus the percentage run by the Kuomintang?
So
who's inflicting all those casualties on the Japanese?
Yeah. So they remember, China, even though they came together for national resistance, the different provinces basically were not equalized like that. So depending on the different provinces the Japanese were in or fighting them in, you would have different composition of forces, either KMT or the communists. So ultimately, it shook out that about 60% of the casualties were communists, about 40% were KMT. That's sort of what worked out. And that had more to do with just, that's where the Japanese wound up fighting. The communists fought more guerrilla, obviously, style. That became sort of their, kind of, avant-gardeness, and also their operating model. And it also became the regions they were in, where guerrilla fighting was really what you had to do, whether they were mountainous or whether they were in jungle, rice paddy, and highly humid areas, lowlands. And when they fought the KMT, they fought more traditional engagements, platoon, company, up to a battalion level. Now, what was interesting, we didn't talk about this piece yet, but when we talk again, some of you might have heard of General Chennault and some of the Flying Tigers, and they weren't the only unit like this, but there was a bunch of let's say, proxy volunteers that weren't discouraged from all over the world to defend the Chinese, and they would fly missions in to resupply to fight along their side, etc. Most of those forces fought with the KMT. And most of it had to not do with that they liked the KMT anymore, but the KMT had more traditional military structure, so they could plan engagement more effectively. So that's, hopefully that answers your question. Now remember, at the end of the day, there was about 18 million Chinese civilians killed during the Japanese 14, 15 year occupation, and about 4 million fighters between the KMT and the communist. And Indonesia had about 8 million people killed, all of which were basically civilians, by the Japanese. About 6 million of those were basically work camp deaths. So they basically had a Holocaust, an Indonesian Holocaust, that really is not studied. I mean, not given the scale of it. There's very few people. There's, few oddball papers, kind of a piece of a book here and there. But those were the major casualty, and a big chunk in Indochina and Korea too, obviously. So that's how you get into the 35 million, 40 million when you count the Japanese included too. Any other questions?
Yeah, Aaron, more of a comment than a question, but I'm reading David Stahl's book on Barbarossa and the German planning. And one thing that strikes me is, despite the Germans and the Japanese having very different cultures, the sheer arrogance, lack of preparation, the lack of scenario planning, what if we screw up or what if this happens sort of thing, is so striking between the Germans in 1941 and the Japanese in 1941.
Yep.
What's there to say about two countries doing the same thing at the same time with such huge consequences?
I mean, look, I would say, the world was unlucky because of the horror that it created. Roughly maybe 75 million people were killed, outside of, the great pandemic in 1918. And it's probably, more volume of actual death than we probably ever had. Maybe not as a percentage, but it's right up there. And at the same time, the world was a little lucky that we had basically two cultures that were on this collision course with their own demise through their own arrogance and desire for the same type of expansion, right? I think that's the key. The key in the end is they both desired. You remember how long it took for the British Empire to get to peak Britain, which was 1921. I mean, it really took them. I mean, you could argue Queen Victoria was her reign is when the largest expansion occurred. But I mean, that occurred over at least 7,500 years, and you could argue hundreds of years, but at least 75 to 100 years. I'm not saying it's a good thing. I'm just pointing out, when you expand an empire at a pace, you look at Russia. I mean, Catherine the Great is clearly the person that kind of creates the wrapper that we call Russia today, sort of finishes it off. And that still happens over her whole lifetime, right? I mean, so there's something about when you want to expand this fast and sort of step on so many different parties simultaneously, even if you get short-term success in it, you start to, number one, you have a lot to actually support when you start talking about this many countries and different peoples and regions and topography. And then once you get someone countering you, you're having to fight on their terms where they want to fight, plus likely, guerrilla campaigns against you in all these other places. And there's something about when that happens that is just ultimately not very sustainable. I mean, look at today. You can't, there's no colonial expansion at scale or sort of optional invasion that can work today. Just one. But imagine doing 5, 10, 15 of these at once. I mean, it just, it's absurd, right? It just doesn't add up.
The strange irony of that war is that the German Wehrmacht was considered the best army ever fielded, and the Japanese not so much, but they had a level of commitment by individual soldiers that has no equal in history, and yet they sort of took their eyes off the bottom economic line.
I mean,
they didn't realize they were not competitive. I mean, the Germans had excellent, they invented the first assault rifle,
sure,
the first ballistic missile, the first jet plane, but they didn't think it through and realized they couldn't scale it.
That's right. And at the end of the day, if you want to look at the two sides, I would take General Zhukov on ground, and I'll take Admiral Nimitz in the water at sea. And if you look at both of them, not just them individually, but them leading ultimately the forces of that won the war, the thing that you could say is the key word there, which is scale, right? Both of those forces built about 20 to 30 things each, and they built a bazillion of them. And they trained in those 20, 30 things, whether it's a destroyer, a sub, the same type, the same, torpedo system, the same, so that you could create this scalability. I mean, you could argue, our fast attack carriers, which we built, our light carriers, we built 74 of them, which is insane when you think of the numbers. I mean, it's just, at peak, we had 98 carriers in the Pacific. That was the T-34 tank, basically, of the water. And, you think of how many thousands of planes we could put on those 98 carriers, which means we had literally floating islands wherever we wanted to circle something and just pound. And it was dynamic because you could have small planes, which could provide close air support and, et cetera. So, it's you have to look at that relationship there that both the Soviets and the US got right.
Well, you have like a total absence of strategic thought
Sure.
from the point of view of saying, how do you deliver a killing blow?
Yeah. Or how, and if you don't, then how do you sustain?
The Germans may have thought that they could, maybe they had more of a, that they could go to Vladivostok and they could, have Fortress Europe, but the idea is that you have no concept of how you're going to knock the United States out of the game.
That's right.
You have to your only chance for victory is for the United States to basically cease hostilities.
Well, yeah, and this is the whole thinking the Japanese had, which is they called it it was in kanji, it's written, it's basically 180. So they had a 6-month plan because they had that much in reserves when it came to resources, oil and coal and so on. They wanted to deliver this sort of theoretical knockout blow, which if you want to be honest, wasn't, we'll get into this when we talk about Pearl Harbor. I mean, what they were able to do at Pearl Harbor was genius in terms of the strategic approach they had. But when you look at the sum total,
the point is, it wasn't genius strategically. Maybe it was genius operationally.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I meant. I mean, operationally,
strategically, it had no point because it didn't knock the U.S. out of the war.
Well, yeah, and because there was no plan beyond, there was no plan beyond Pearl Harbor into Hawaii or into the Western U.S. where you knock out all our naval capacity. And then you blockade, the Panama Canal, put forces there.
I asked long ago what their population was. How are you going to project that much force against such greater numbers of people?
Absolutely, but I mean the only shot they did have is if they blockaded Panama Canal, put a force down there, take it over, force us to go down through the through the eastern, through the Western Caribbean and Mexico, and then Mexico starts to probably say, what the hell are you doing here? And so now it becomes some goofy thing, if they did that, plus they invaded Hawaii, actually invaded, with a land force and take it. So now they got a platform to attack the West Coast. I mean, if they had that type of thinking, it wouldn't have worked probably anyways.
Crazy to, attack the West Coast. So what? You're
well, no. The key here is naval power. No. The so what is naval power, right? So if the U.S. can only get its ships, because you're not going to put them through South America, right? Because the weather is terrible down there. So you're not going to take them, south of Argentina. So you're going to come all the way through the Indian Ocean, and then that's where the Japanese would put its fleets, its sub-fleets, to attack us coming into the Western Pacific. That would have been, there was one crazy captain, naval captain, that sort of had this plan. He was put out to pasture in Indochina, because they thought he was too crazy. But that was his idea. His idea was basically, it's not enough to hit us at Pearl Harbor. We have to take over Hawaii. We have to, and then from that we have to knock out our fleets and our capacity to make fleets in San Diego, LA, San Francisco, Seattle, etc., which ultimately wouldn't work because we would just build planes and attack their fleets in the ocean. I mean, that would be our innovation there. I mean, that would have worked. And then we would just fight our way back to Hawaii. Hawaii would have just been, Iwo Jima 1.0. And then we would have just, it just would have taken maybe another year.
Over and above the purely military, both for the Germans and for the Japanese. I mean, to the extent you made the comparison between the Soviet Union was to the Germans as China was to the Japanese.
Yep.
In both cases, the attacker did not provide for the establishment of a civil society.
Oh, of course not.
In the places that they were conquering. So, for example, it was, the problem with blitzkrieg is that you have to allow your enemy to surrender. And the enemy has to think that surrender is a possible option, as it was for the French.
Yeah, but the problem, the problem the Japanese had with China is they did not believe the Chinese were people.
As I say, it's the same. So there was no concept of having, so their only concept of a civil society there was basically constant, a slave society.
Yes, I mean, basically their goal, if you want to simplify their goal, their template that they built was Korea. They wanted to Koreafy Asia. In essence, they become this new sort of, colonial, I forgot what's the old name for like the colonial, like the British, like those colonial leaders. Like I forgot what they're called, but
Raj?
Huh?
The Raj?
Well, yeah, it's like that. Yeah, like that little group at the top. It's like 1,000 people run 10 million, right? Like they wanted to be
Raj in India.
Yeah, but so that they wanted a model, which is really kind of what they had in Korea.
But with the Germans, when they were planning Barbarossa, they actually put on paper, I mean, they were planning not just to occupy Western Russia, they were going to remove the food from all the inhabitants, starve 30 million Russians.
Yeah.
It didn't cross their mind that might trigger a response.
Well,
fanatic resistance.
Yeah, and you got to realize that, I mean, the first signal that, the first two signals that the Japanese should have picked up on was the fact that the war in China just wasn't going well. And the second one is when the Soviets pounded them into the ground. And those two should have sent signals, but they weren't consuming signals, right? They were on this, they were like a death cult, really, in some ways. I truly believe the Japanese, some percentage of them, I mean, especially in the most super ultra nationalists, were in essence the equivalent of sort of a religious death cult at that point.
I was looking at a book by Ivan Morris the other day, who was a scholar of in Japan.
Yep.
He wrote a book about the tradition of the noble loser in Japanese culture. It didn't start with the kamikazes. He claims it just went deep into the national personality, if I can put it that way, that they would do wild romantic things expecting to die. It was
Yeah,
just,
absolutely. I mean, there's this one, and we can, hopefully, and I know we're running over now, so I appreciate everyone. But hopefully, number one, did everyone like this? Was this good? I mean, I know we spent a lot of time on the background.
It was really great.
It was great. And one proposition before I move on, I want to make this once a month if you guys are on to it, because there's a lot of battles. There's a lot going on here, and I think
that's absolutely.
We don't do it justice of just doing it taking it one at a time. Let's make it once a month until we run out of everything.
Yeah. So
go ahead. Sorry.
No, absolutely. So one of the things that I think is really that people lose sight of when it comes to how the Japanese militarized in their government, right? And so we sort of talk about how this, they have this very dualist world where you have this sort of commercial, more modernizing class. At the same time, you had these more militant, Japanese nationalists in the 20s. And then by the 30s, they sort of crush them completely and they take over, the real means of government. And they didn't have any outside inputs into that. And what I mean by that, I don't mean just other countries. I mean, even within Japanese society. I mean, these were almost like clans, where the Navy was a clan, the Army was a clan, the Big Six were like a clan, so really in some ways, the militarization of the government was just an extension of the old clan society that was really at the heart of who Japan was, even as they modernized. And so this sort of created this inevitability that, and one of the things that I have in a future presentation is I've put together the whole U.S. and ultimately allied, but mostly it was like 90% U.S. invasion of the main 4 islands plan. And when you look at it, the scale, right? I mean, it was going to be the largest land battle in history, period. I mean, it was not going to be a close second, including even the Soviet battles in Kursk and so on, because the scale was going to be, ultimately through 5 waves, it was going to be about 5 million Americans and around 1 million allies. It was going to be over 1,000 ships, 10,000 to 20,000 planes. That's on our side. The Japanese were preparing 20 million civilians to be basically suicide bombers, plus around 10 to 15 million in their forces. And they had 10,000 kamikaze pilots and planes, plus another several thousand sort of submarines. They had thousands of little frogmen teams. Like if you guys remember the USS Cole, like 20 years ago, that was hit in the Gulf, that was going to go broadside with a boat, basically a bomb boat, so they, so this thing was going to be this, like half a dozen Leningrads, basically, or, 5 or 10 Leningrads. And we'll get into, and that was the real planning, because, this idea, this atomic thing was like, whatever, right? That sounded like a space ray, right? It just didn't have any, the people who knew about it sort of believed it, but the other people said, sure, I can't plan on your space ray working. I have to plan on if we have to take, and the key to this, to understand the scale of this, and when we talk about this next time, is Okinawa. So Okinawa offers the closest template of what we were going to run into. So in Okinawa, about 500,000 civilians and about 150,000 Japanese soldiers, and basically 135,000 soldiers were killed, and 150,000 of the civilians, or more, maybe 200,000 civilians were killed. And the U.S. had 65,000 casualties. Wow. So, you do the math, just on Kishu, which is roughly, let's say conservatively, 10 times bigger than Okinawa was going to be. Maybe. And
Aaron, another thing is when you're going to talk about battles, like in 4 weeks time, which I'll put you in the schedule. Would you be also giving how many planes went down?
Oh yeah, I'm going to give you all that.
I love the statistics like that, and I just for the sake of time, I apologize.
No,
You
absolutely.
give me control, and I'm going to schedule you. You don't want to reveal everything. You know, I can always a little bit further down. And this was such an amazing presentation. Thank you so much. I'm really, like, this is amazing. I loved it.
So you should have control. Do you have control now or no?
Yeah.
Okay.
Let me see.
Someone rose their hand. And by the way, sorry if I couldn't see you raise your hands before.
Mark did.
Yep.
Mark already had spoken, I think. Mark,
Okay.
did you ask your question already or no?
Yeah, my question was that was the one about the
No,
cartoon. What did the dragon mean? What did the fascisti mean? What did I didn't understand what why would he have a fascisti?
I'll look that up for you. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm not really. Actually, it's great that you brought that up because I've been sort of kicking around all these cartoons, which, this isn't our generations that we grew up. I mean, some of us grew up with a little bit of that, but I mean, this is the old world, 19th century, first maybe 40 years of the 20th century, where you had these, very exaggerated cartoons. And so maybe what I can do is try to dig into the sort of all the meaning of a lot of these cartoons. I mean, some of them are obvious, but some of those pieces, I mean, they're all telling a story, right? They're signaling.
What happened before you had talk radio?
Yeah, you're right. That's exactly right. Great point.
You needed a way to communicate ideology.
Yep. No, it's a great point. Absolutely.
Propaganda in the most neutral sense of what that word is.
Yep. No, that's a fantastic point. That's exactly what it is. And so I'll
Aaron, can you pass me control?
You don't have control? I thought you
had. Sorry.
Hold on a second.
When you click on my name, it just says pass control.
Oh, okay. Oh, really? Oh, okay. Oh, under more?
Make me
You're right.
I apologize.
Change host. I'm sorry.
Yeah. I'm just going to run down the schedule before, because, look, people still around. This is amazing. I mean, 3 hours, amazing. I'm telling you. I mean, it's short of amazing. Let me go into schedule. Oh, what the hell?
Oh, and then Zach, if you want to give me, if it's the same place to push the file to, or if there's another place you want me to push the file, just send me an email or text.
Okay, no problem.
In those articles about Chalk and Gall.
Yeah, I'll do that.
By the way, guys, do you want to create? Do you want, like on my channel YouTube, you can make comments and stuff, and then you can drop, the comments on it once you subscribe. And when you drop the comments and then the links and whatever, and since those links are to YouTube videos, like you were saying, then gigs you guys are interested in.
I mean, one of the things we could do that would be a little fun is we could have our own little, very simple site, and then we could link it from the YouTube channel so people could see each, kind of like, how you have how people do podcasts, and then underneath it they have their information. So each one of these could be kind of all our links, because at this point I have so many zillions of references. I don't include them in these because it take forever to go over the references.
So do you think you can establish the site, or?
Let me go look, and we can, you and I can talk during the week if you want to, or whatever.
Sure. I mean, that would be nice, because then we can put all our.
Or if someone's already done that and is sort of good at it, I mean, I'm, like, I don't care who does it.
I can set up through, Square.
Yeah, exactly.
I can set it up pretty quickly. That's not a problem. I just want to scan through the schedule quickly, and I apologize if I'm taking people's time. So next week we have Paul and Greg up on, Greek art and theater. Then we Russian front motives, John on 9/13. I'm just going to scan through a couple of weeks. Then we have Persian War, which is Lisa and Richard. And then after that, Glorifying USA. Aaron, I'm going to switch it with Pacific War Part 3. And I guess we'll call it like Pearl Harbor. How do you want to call it? Whatever you want. Aaron's still around? Hello?
Yeah, no, sorry. I was getting some water.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
We can call it. I mean, what would be great is the U.S. responds, right? So like all these acts and laws that we passed, which is before Pearl Harbor. So which a lot of those questions everyone asked today were sort of around those.
So it'll be that, and it'll be Pearl Harbor. And then, so there'll be both those pieces. So kind of like the U.S. responds, and then Pearl Harbor happens, basically.
Okay, got you. So I'm just going to put Pacific War. So for my spelling, because war part 3, and then U.S. response, USA response, and Pearl Harbor. All right, and then you're still there. Okay, then we have a second war, Persian War, Thermopylae, which is Risa and Richard. Then we have after that we'll have, I guess I'll have to continue on Cold War and Dooley's. Maybe you'll continue on the Pacific War, because I don't think we're going to be able to end.
Oh yeah, no, trust me.
And 4, yeah. So,
yeah.
So I'm gonna take a couple of presentations out for the sake of us continuing that.
Yeah, I mean, the ones with me, you can feel free to do whatever you want with. Don't worry.
Yeah, I think it worked out really well, because you have those presentations anyway. So
yeah.
So that worked out pretty well. So I'm going to continue on that, and I think it's good because now we're going to have a following on that. So I'm just going to say Pacific. Okay, Pacific War. Just for myself. Part 3. Part 4 now. All right, that's that. Then we have on 10 to 17, we have Phoenicians language, which is going to be Rolf, and then Carthage and Seafarers is Greg and Zach. Greg is going to do Carthage, I'll do Seafarers, Phoenicians. And then I guess I'm going to stop after that. As Battle of Kosovo is going to be Vlad. I have to notify him in October. But on our other presentations, we have 916 Gilgamesh, whoever signed up. So read it if you can. And John, if you would send us the link to which versions we're reading.
Okay.
Yeah, I think you sent it to me. You told me, but I'm totally. I think it was Stephen.
I think I did send you the link. I'll send it again.
Yeah, it was Stephen something. Stephen Millen or something. And then it was that. On 9/6 we have an interesting presentation by Joshua Gillingham and Stephen Dunn. They're writing a book on Northern languages or Viking languages, and they want to do a presentation on Harald the Fine Hair, and unification of Norway and in a Viking conquest of Iceland. So that should be really interesting. And they're creating a presentation, and he's going to send it to me, I guess, to vet it, and then he'll present it from his computer. So I think I'm going to try to have once a month a scholar, either a historian or a professor, to come in and kind of do a presentation where we can, ask all the questions and stuff like that. I mean, we'll see how it goes. I mean, if you guys like it, we'll continue on that.